Next on Investigative Report. Tearing down history, a misplaced countercultural movement. The current climate of tearing down statues of people long since past, coupled with affixing the gripe of the week demands to pose, is hardly a noteworthy movement as set against the backdrop of homegrown American history. Granted, there is injustice in not having one's leaders listen to your opinions and concerns, but wouldn't it be a truly powerful statement if these same massive individuals showed up in their own communities for hands-on support to charitable organizations over burning flags and damaging public property? Today, these riots, thinly veiled as peaceful protests, have little to do with freedom of speech nor freedom of assembly, as much as they are motivated by political affiliations that drive their constituents to the streets. The First Amendment of the Constitution granted the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition a government for redress of grievances, not the government to assemble the people like a third world nation. And now, tearing down history, a misplaced countercultural movement. The architects of the Constitution wrote the First Amendment as a check on the power of government over the citizens they swore an oath to serve. In its definition, the First Amendment prevents the government from making laws that regulate an establishment of religion, prohibit the free exercise of religion, or abridge the freedom of speech, the freedom of the press, the freedom of assembly, or the right to petition the government for a redress of grievances, which means you have the right to complain to your own government, in private and in public. Now, nowhere in this amendment is the right to torch buildings, kill people, and destroy public property. These crimes are not protected under the First Amendment, but are covered under the anarchy statutes at the federal level. Criminal anarchy is regulated under 18 U.S.C. 2385, which makes it an offense punishable by 20 years, mind you, of imprisonment to advocate the overthrow of the U.S. government. Now, violation of this statute can also result in losing your U.S. citizenship. Now, you might have noticed some of the people that crashed the Capitol were tried under the same statute, but people who did the rioting were not. And when the Constitutional Convention drafted the First Amendment, they had no idea that the future members of Congress or the President himself would try to manipulate the citizens to do their bidding in opposition to this one amendment. They wrote it for the citizen, not for the President or the Democrats or Republicans to play you. And for example, the last rioting that occurred over George Floyd's murder was either manipulated or aggressed against by members of Congress strictly down party lines for political gain. So they were using you as citizens for political gain. Unfortunately, this tail wagging the dog approach would come at a heated time in global history during the pandemic, when many citizens were fed up with their government's handling of the virus. From China to the United States to Europe to Russia, it didn't matter. People were fed up. But the importance here is not for members of government who can be bought or sold for few re-election dollars. My concern is for those citizens who were manipulated to protest operating in opposition to their own stated assembly goals, the right to assemble. If the goal was to bring attention to the police killing innocent people based upon color, then what does burning the buildings of entrepreneurs that are struggling to survive and killing innocent bystanders have to do with that? If anybody could answer me that question, I'd like to know. Now, in each one of these riots, we neglect to add up the cost before the first match is even lit on how much death and destruction will take place. So you always see members of Congress goading it on, Democrat or Republican, even the president, for or against. Now, the 1965 Watts riot in Los Angeles resulted in the deaths of 34 people, 1,000 injuries, and more than $40 million worth of property was destroyed. Hundreds of buildings and whole city blocks are burned to the ground. The only thing this damage wrought is the loss of employment and access to goods and services, mind you, and needed medicine for the children and families that lived in those affected areas. So if it was to send a message to those people in charge, they never got it. The 1992 Rodney King riots in Los Angeles resulted in a total of 63 deaths, 2,500 injuries, and at the minimum $446 million in property damage. The resultant aftermath of this riot was the same as the previous riot 27 years earlier. This time the loss was greater for women with infant children and those needing local stores and businesses that were destroyed. Now they had no place to go. Even the representative in Congress said they had no place to go. The May 2020 George Floyd riots resulted in a total of 19 deaths and numerous amount of underreported injuries, 14,000 arrests, and $2 billion in damages nationally. This is the highest recorded damage from civil disorder in U.S. history. This riot cost actually more than a Revolutionary War in this country. Even more astounding than the injuries and death is that these mass riots were not motivated as much by the death of Mr. Floyd, as tragic as that may be. These mass protests were driven by unemployed citizens of every country who were tired of law and governance itself. Now, this incident helped to galvanize them into one body, to send world leaders a message that we are one against you over your mishandling of this COVID pandemic. Now, I believe that any incident could have taken place at that point and brought the whole world body to the streets. In our investigation preceding the March 1991 Rodney King riots, we noted that there has never been a black cause given that has generated a larger gathering of Caucasian Americans, let alone citizens in other countries. Now, in comparison to George Floyd's murder, the whole world similarly witnessed the filming of the Rodney King beating by 4 members of the Los Angeles Police Department, and yet there was no mass U.S. protests outside of LA. Now, in fact, the riots were contained in Los Angeles and went no further. People may have been dismayed in black communities in other states, but it didn't reach the level as Los Angeles. And tragically, since Rodney King incident, there has been at least 50 such killings by police, all of which generated great buzz on the nightly news, mass criticism coupled with black citizens marching, and yes, riots that damaged property and businesses and has taken lives, but no global community came out for the support they would pretend to give during the unemployment of the COVID pandemic. During the COVID pandemic, everybody was unemployed. Kids couldn't go to school. Parents were fed up. They wanted to react in the streets, and this gave them a moment to do it. In fact, I told my wife one day as we were sitting in traffic, awaiting a huge gathering of Caucasian well-off Americans protesting, that this was about as phony as a $3 bill to protest for George Floyd. Now, I insisted that just as soon as these people who feigned concern were cleared by the government to go back to work, you would never see them again at a rally for black life, I guarantee you. And there has been people that's been killed since George Floyd, but you don't see them in the street. You see, there has never been a history where masses of people take off from their jobs to attend a rally for someone they do not know unless they feel true kinship to that person. Now, in your place of employment where you work, how many people would request time off from their paid position with retirement to attend a recent mob burning of your town's city center? I would guarantee you, no one. Yes, it would seem that with each and every statue destroyed, the mob literally tears down their own hopes and dreams for the future. Now take a listen to this, and I'll tell you why. Because the vast majority of those statues torn down from their pedestals were people just like them. They were not of gods. Now, I don't mean in a cultural sense. I mean that these people were counterculturalists, just like those protesters in their day. Most protesters today are just counterculturists. They're going against what's currently out. This means that if these people chose to tear down a statue of a counterculturist from the past, then young people down the road will tear down their ideas and images in the future, I guarantee you. That's why we are where we are today. And all of this is done under the guise of fighting for one's rights and opinions at the behest of separate political parties. I'm a Republican, I'm a Democrat, I'm an independent. Look at how the House Speaker Nancy Pelosi and representatives, the Democratic representatives, took to one knee while wearing kente cloth around their necks, along with other Democratic members, to feign solidarity with the supposed protesters. Now, if a woman's been there in Congress forever and a day, she never did this, it doesn't look real. This act led to many of academia and the black community to comment on this political stunt, just as they did when President Trump stood in front of the St. John's Church with a Bible in his hand. I said to you before, political parties send their members to the streets and keep them there long enough to achieve their aims, no matter how tragic the situation may get, no matter how many people lose their life, no matter how many people lose their jobs. Now, in modern America, we are witness to a bizarre form of governance where our leaders believe that it is they who have the right to petition the citizens for redress of their grievances. It's like the law was written for them. Now that I have discussed the merits of the First Amendment, let me pivot to the supposed virtue signaling of the looters and rioters that never had to repair the damage that they caused, never had to put out one fire that they lit. Those citizens who by default get the police force fully funded and enlarged after the riot by their behaviors than was ever before the protest. So it drove up police, not down. To the people who show up for the fires but are absent for charity, the homeless, litter pickup, security in their own neighborhoods, and most importantly, the vote, which is always underdone.
You're watching MNN, the Men's Channel.
I believe that this best done by comparing and contrasting their contributions to society against those of the people whose statues they tore down. Now, this will prove who is truly human if you can compare yourself against someone you see as either a monster or a racist and come out appearing worst in behavior. So it's easy to call somebody a racist. It's easy to call somebody a monster from the past that you have to tear down a statue. But compare the behavior of them to you. Let us weigh these historical figures' common humanity and their off-duty contributions against the people that tore down metal statues or burned communities that didn't need to be burned. Communities that they did not have to pay for, as I said before, or build with their bare hands. In doing this, we can prove that these figures contributed far more to society, despite their flaws, than the mobs or political parties that sought to tear them down. I challenge you to compare this. Now, remembering first that each person that tugged against those ropes tied to those statues is what society refers to as a counterculturalist, like I said before. They're going against current society. Now, counterculturalist is nothing more than a person or group of people that are set against the past history or culture that came before them. Just that simple. But what went over everyone's head in those riots is that those statue figures were counterculturalist. I submit to you that each one of those demonized statue figures that were pulled down for their mountings was a person who rebelled against the norm of society in such a substantive way that there was a statue and a place in history made for them. You see, typically statues are never erected for people who go along with status quo. If you go along to get along, there won't be a statue for you. Statues are designed for those who go against the grain to improve society, for those who will follow their after death in life. So when you look up to somebody, it's because they did something before you. Now, because of this, no matter how many monuments we tear down, or how many books we choose to rewrite or burn, similar to Hitler's reimagination of history, we still cannot erase these men's contributions to mankind. But counterculturalism is not a white or black history, but a history of a human race. Outside of the black community, many people saw Martin Luther King Jr. in his day as a counterculturalist, and indeed he was. And not because of his color, but because of his stance against the status quo. These are the hallmarks of a counterculturalists. But Martin Luther King never had to add up the cost of a riot during his many marches for equality. Now, in rare instances where a riot did break out in his day, it was because of people infiltrating his marchers who leaned more towards Malcolm X and violence as a way to get what they wanted out of life. When King did notice these riots happening, he called off the marches immediately. Human history is replete with counterculturalists. Now, if we go back almost 500 years before Martin Luther King and the Civil Rights Movement, we would find another man named Martin Luther. So Martin Luther King is not the first person of priority with that name. Now, Martin Luther, who was a counterculturalist against the Catholic Church of his day. Now, the German theologian Martin Luther was called a heretic by the Catholic Church, and many people of his time wanted him dead for his stance and his ideas, which birthed the Protestant Reformation. So I'm sure by now you've heard about the Protestant Reformation. Now, because of his counterculturalist behavior and contribution to society, we now have many different denominations of churches, beginning with the Protestant Church in the year 1517. Now, but during all of the riots I named, no one tore down either Martin Luther or Martin Luther King's statue, neither the Martin statue. No one tore down a statue of Crispus Attucks in Boston, Massachusetts. And Mr. Attucks was a counterculturalist in his day of the first order. And hopefully you heard of this guy. History starts this country with him. You see, in truth, Attucks was a former slave who ran to freedom and was the first person to be shot in a scuffle against the British troops that would initiate the Revolutionary War in this country. If it had not been for the shot that was heard around the world and his death, there would be no United States of America. It would still be a British colony. Now, Attucks grabbed the bayonet of one of the soldiers present on his rifle. Now, he thought they were oppressing the colonists, and he knocked the soldier down to the ground. Now, another soldier then fired his gun, and Attucks and two others were killed. Attucks, for those of you who may not know, as I said before, was a black man who was the first publicly executed counterculturalist against the British status quo. So, if you think about these riots today, it's not the first time. Yes, Attucks was a black man, but what about the other men who were from this country and they had statues torn down of them? Were they all honorable people outside of what we have been told about them? You know, about them owning slaves or human beings? Firstly, all of them did not own slaves. In fact, Mr. Lincoln, who I will discuss shortly, was the first president to run on a platform ending slavery forever. And yet he was lumped in for the great statue destruction. That happens when you don't even know about political past. But long before Lincoln, we go back to the statue of a man who was credited with discovering America, namely Mr. Christopher Columbus. Christopher Columbus, who was referred to as the Admiral of the Ocean now, was a man who was seen as a rebel. This guy was a counterculturalist. A man who believed that there was a new world on the other side of the ocean, which was counter to the opinions of the elites in his day. This guy's insane, he's out of his mind. I mean, fully, some people did believe that it was a land on the other side, but the vast majority did not. Now, if it were not for Columbus' stubborn, rebellious attitude against the status quo, there would have been no earlier voyage to America, en masse. You see, originally Columbus was given finance for a voyage to discover an easier route to Asia. Now, this was to increase trade of goods and services like silk and spices. But after being financed at a cost of 2 million Spanish maravedis, Columbus purposely took his vessels in the opposite direction of what he was supposed to do, or where he was supposed to go. He did not go in the direction that society expected him to go. He sailed those ships in the opposite direction. Now, because of that rebellious spirit, all of us that call ourselves Americans are here because of his misadventures, whether we care to acknowledge that or not, and whether we believe his character was good or not. You have to admit that. The amazing thing is that he made it here at all, especially because his biggest fear since childhood was a body of water. He was afraid of water. Now, after leaving school at the age of 14 to apprentice himself on a trading ship, Columbus ended up spending his entire life on the seas. That was up until his untimely death at the age of 55 years. Contrary to belief, Columbus was not born into a position of privilege in his life. Christopher Columbus was no more than the eldest child of a family of weavers and woolen merchants from the Italian port of Genoa. How many of you can say that? His family was respectable, but they were not wealthy. You have more people that are lower class in this country to middle class that have more money than his family ever did. Now, Columbus neither had the ships nor the financial means to discover the New World. For this reason, he would make his transatlantic voyage under the sponsorship of King Ferdinand II and Queen Isabella I, after begging for funds for 7 years straight when all around couldn't get it. It was very hard to get. Now, Columbus was one counterculturist in a history of counterculturalism that made this country for the good or the ilk what it is today. Just like the riots will change this country for the good or for the ilk for what it is today. Each person who pulls down his or any other statue runs the added risk that their great-grandchildren will also tear down everything that they have ever built over the next 100 years. The old adage rings true, I guess. Here, one man's treasure is another man's trash. Or what many of us see as a source of pain for us is a source of pleasure for somebody else.
You're watching MNN, the Men's Channel.
The next countercultural statue many a rioter sought to tear down is General George Washington. General Washington, as you know, led the colonial forces to victory over the British during the American Revolution. Now, he did this despite of horrific battle conditions. He was later elected president of the convention that wrote the Constitution, and many credit his leadership with the Bill of Rights. Now, the Bill of Rights protects peaceful protests, and it was made sure that it was ratified. So you couldn't protest a day without the Bill of Rights. Now, Washington was then elected America's first president and served for 2 terms until he peacefully transitioned that job over to the then John Adams. Now, that same Bill of Rights that I spoke of at the opening of this report is what provides the average citizen today the right to petition their governor for a redress of grievances. Like I said before, you could not do this before this particular amendment. Now, under the previous British monarchy, before the Revolution, these rights were not accorded to citizens who were seen as nothing more than peasants or subjects to the king. But just like Columbus before him, Washington was a counterculturalist in his day. In fact, Washington and everyone who affixed their signatures to the Declaration of Independence would place themselves squarely on a list of citizens that the British government wanted to see no less than dead for going against the crown. This was anarchy. They call it being a rebel, or call it counterculturalism. It's all the same, but the outcome is much different than just going to the streets to start a fire for no outcome. But what those people did, despite what you think of them, led to something beautiful we enjoy each and every day. As we brag that we were born in Maryland instead of California, Philadelphia instead of Florida. We even make up NFL teams to compete in one state against another to show pride in this land that many consider stolen. That's odd. You brag about your hometown, but you consider this country stolen. My question is, how does someone who brags about loving a state and a land they consider stolen affix a rope to a statue that represents their own behaviors as if it were something to be ashamed of? You see, isn't it funny that when we call these statuesque people out, we are actually calling ourselves out as well? You can't say that somebody took over a country that you live in. If rioters insist that it was bad that those figures had slaves, I will remind them that not only are there no slaves today, beyond the slaves we make of ourselves to our jobs instead of spending time with our families, who we swore to love. A slave is to a job. Beyond that, we are slaves to our political parties that maneuver us like chess pieces to do their bidding in order to win them re-election. You always notice after re-election, there's no more calls to the street. I move now to the next historical figure that people have pulled down in statue. namely President Abraham Lincoln. I mean, tell me, what did he do wrong? He was no slave owner. Abraham Lincoln never owned a slave. His views in his own words about slavery were these, and I quote, "I am naturally anti-slavery. If slavery is not wrong, nothing is wrong. I cannot remember when I did not so think and feel." End quote. You see, Abraham Lincoln was not rich either. Just like Columbus, he was not rich. Nor was he an aristocrat. Lincoln grew up in a family in Kentucky and Indiana far poorer than many of the upper middle class elites that participated in that protest turned riot. Even the little congressmen that participated in Washington, D.C., they walked down the street to ensure their re-election. What many people do not know about Lincoln is that he was a very generous person with his time and what little money he had. It's one thing to give a government money, but what about your own money? Lincoln donated to Ireland's great hunger relief during the Great Irish Potato Famine. Abraham Lincoln was only one of 15,000 people worldwide to donate money to Ireland during the Great Irish Famine. Now, many times, Lincoln gave his personal money out of his pockets to citizens who visit him in need at the White House while expecting nothing from them in return. And back then, you could go up to the White House, to his office. There weren't these gates, no Secret Service. But of course, everyone is aware of the rudimentary definition of President Abraham Lincoln issuance of the Emancipation Proclamation Act in 1863. Now, this happened as the nation approached its third and most bloody Civil War year. The proclamation declared that all persons held as slaves within the rebellious states are henceforward shall be free. In this one act, you have the only figure in world history who becomes the king of counterculturalism for all times to come. Nobody stopped that sort of thing in a day. But did you know that Lincoln is also credited with you being able to attain credit easier or have ease of banking? Now, to promote opportunity, a dynamic economy, and a stronger union, Lincoln and Secretary of Treasury, Mr. Salmon P. Chase, conceived the national banking system and the office of the comptroller of the currency, and now in this way they wanted to regulate and supervise it. So Lincoln took pride in signing the National Currency Act, which he believed now would provide great benefit to the people and to the government. And today you are a beneficiary of that system. Now, the national system, he declared in his State of Union message of 1864, created a reliable and yet permanent influence and support of the national credit and to protect people against the losses in the use of paper currency. So it's not just a problem today, this has always been a problem. Now, our next and final statue torn down during a supposed peaceful protest was that of Thomas Jefferson. Now, if you can imagine beyond Mr. Jefferson's flaws to find out what type of real person he was, you will find a counterculturist who was for the people. Understand first, we encapsulate somebody's entire life, what they've done. And one of Jefferson's biggest fights in his day is that he wanted the government to fully fund the underfunded poor houses. Now, today you might not hear the word poor houses, but back then they were called poor houses. Poor houses in this day were an institution that tended to members of the lower class, people who didn't have money or enough to survive, who desperately needed housing. Today you might imagine these as a precursor to public housing. Now, Jefferson strongly believed that poor houses were underfunded and had failed in achieving their mission to help the people that they were supposed to help. Now, throughout his political career, Jefferson endorsed and sought to reform poor houses until his last day in office. This has got to say something about this man. Now, Jefferson adamantly believed that all children should have access to education. Today, congressmen and senators fight about this. They don't want to give money. In his notes on the state of Virginia, Jefferson states that all children should learn some art, trade, or business. But first, they should attend public school for a minimum of 3 years. Back then, there was this type of thing where you go to school up to 12th grade. These grades were added on. Now, he wished to ensure education for all children, specifically those who could not afford it, even if it came at public expense. Jefferson wrote his personal views on poverty into the Declaration of Independence. Jefferson spent much of his political career trying to save ordinary citizens from the oppressive aristocrats of his day. In ways he spoke out against himself. Even in slavery, he spoke out against himself. Jefferson touches on his personal views in the Declaration of Independence when he wrote that all men are born with the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This makes no government able to rule this type of statement. Now, in Jefferson's eyes, all men were born equal. He believed in self-reliance. Jefferson believed that the government should assume responsibility for the poor, but he also wished to go beyond this. See, Jefferson wanted to make the poor self-reliant so they could prosper. There's a difference. What is a quote? Feed a man a fish, you feed him for a day. Teach a man a fish, you teach him. He can eat for a lifetime, right? Now, many of his poverty proposals were geared towards urgent needs and were meant to be used as a temporary solution, not long range, until a person could get back on their feet. Jefferson believed in health care. Jefferson believed in the importance of leading a healthy lifestyle. Now, Jefferson also thought that without health, there is no happiness. So you can have a pursuit of happiness if you don't have the health to achieve it. Throughout Jefferson's life, he made numerous attempts to improve health care. Now, while he was in Paris, Jefferson worked alongside healthcare reformers because he wanted to try to revise the French healthcare system. Now, that was a good start. But he carried his passion for health back with him to the United States, and there he fought to reduce disparities in health among Americans. Doesn't sound like too much of a bad guy. Now, Jefferson wanted slaves to receive an education. In a letter that Jefferson wrote to Robert Pleasants, the man advocated that Virginia's educational system should provide education for slaves to prepare them for freedom. So far before Lincoln, Emancipation Proclamation, this has always been bandied about. Now, Jefferson pushed Pleasants to introduce this legislation. Jefferson saw education as a means of empowering the powerless to empower themselves. But I digress, and we tear down another statue tomorrow. For Investigative Report, this is Charles Rivers. Good night.